By the end of 1914, the Western Front had ceased to function as a theater of maneuver. What began as a war of movement in August had transformed, within 4 months, into a continuous fortified front extending from the North Sea coast to the Swiss frontier. This transformation resulted from the outcome of successive operations rather than deliberate design and shaped subsequent military planning on both sides. German war planning in 1914 assumed the rapid defeat of France through a concentrated offensive in the West. This assumption collapsed in September 1914 when German forces were halted and compelled to withdraw following the Battle of the Marne. Subsequent attempts to regain initiative along the Aisne River did not restore operational mobility. Both coalitions then attempted to outflank one another northward in a series of movements later termed the Race to the Sea. By November 1914, these movements produced a continuous line of opposing field fortifications rather than envelopment. The trench network that emerged was initially shallow and improvised. Its persistence resulted from repeated operational outcomes rather than long-term planning. During late 1914 and throughout 1915, both sides conducted offensive operations intended to rupture the front and restore movement. These included British attacks at Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915, Auber's Ridge in May, and Loos in September, as well as French offensives in Artois and Champagne. In each case, artillery fire enabled limited penetration of forward positions, but advances stalled once attacking forces encountered intact secondary defenses and defensive fire. Artillery could not be advanced rapidly under fire, and infantry units lacked the means to exploit initial gains. By mid-1915, trench systems had developed depth and redundancy across the Western Front. Frontline positions were supported by secondary and reserve trenches connected by communication routes. Barbed wire obstacles increased in density. Dugouts were reinforced with timber and concrete and constructed at increasing depth. Machine guns were deployed to deliver overlapping fire across open ground. Artillery, while central to offensive planning, remained constrained by limitations in observation, shell reliability, and accuracy against concealed targets. Casualty figures reflected the absence of decisive outcomes. British forces suffered approximately 60,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, during the Battle of Loos in September and October 1915. French casualties in the Artois and Champagne offensives of 1915 exceeded 300,000 across multiple operations. These losses did not produce sustained territorial penetration. Gains were limited in depth and frequently reversed by counterattack. German forces, while generally operating defensively, also sustained significant casualties and committed increasing manpower to holding fixed positions. By the end of 1915, the Western Front functioned as a system of mutual containment. Offensive operations continued, but none produced an operational decision. Military activity increasingly emphasized sustaining positions, rotating units, and maintaining supply rather than maneuver. Political authorities continued to authorize major operations, reflecting the requirement to employ expanding mass armies and industrial output rather than the expectation of rapid battlefield resolution. Coalition dynamics shaped this environment. France bore the primary burden of ground combat on the Western Front during 1914 and 1915. Repeated French offensives reduced the pool of experienced infantry and artillery personnel. British participation expanded during the same period but remained uneven. In August 1914, Britain deployed a professional force of approximately 120,000 men. By the end of 1915, Britain had raised several new armies through voluntary enlistment, with conscription introduced in early 1916, though many formations lacked extensive combat experience. Germany faced concurrent structural constraints. The failure to defeat France in 1914 resulted in continued commitment to a two-front war. Forces were required on the Eastern Front throughout 1915. The British naval blockade increasingly restricted access to imported raw materials and foodstuffs, contributing to material shortages by late 1915. German defensive doctrine emphasized economy of force, but this did not eliminate manpower expenditure. Allied planning for 1916 reflected accumulated operational outcomes. Inter-Allied conferences held in late 1915 examined the concentration of forces in a limited number of sectors rather than the continuation of dispersed attacks. Planning documents from this period show preparation for prolonged operations involving large artillery groupings, extensive logistics, and sustained infantry deployment rather than short-duration assaults. The selection of the Somme sector followed from these constraints. The area lay at the boundary between British and French army sectors, reducing the need for major redeployment. Rail networks in northern France permitted large-scale movement of artillery, ammunition, and supplies. Existing force dispositions allowed concentration without reopening adjacent sectors. These factors established the logistical feasibility of sustained operations. Sustaining modern artillery warfare required continuous delivery of ammunition in very large quantities, along with medical evacuation, engineering support, and reinforcement. The Somme region possessed rail capacity sufficient to support such requirements over an extended period. Planning records indicate preparation for sustained offensive activity rather than brief operations. In February 1916, German forces initiated a major offensive against Verdun. The operation rapidly absorbed French divisions and artillery assets. French capacity for offensive operations elsewhere diminished as resources were redirected to the Verdun sector. This development narrowed Allied operational options without altering the broader stalemate on the Western Front. As a result, the Somme assumed increased operational significance within Allied planning. British forces, whose newly raised formations were approaching readiness for large-scale deployment, were positioned to assume a greater share of offensive responsibility. This adjustment occurred within the framework of coalition coordination rather than unilateral initiative. By early 1916, the conditions that produced the Battle of the Somme were established. The Western Front remained a continuous fortified system. Previous offensives had not restored maneuver. Industrial mobilization enabled unprecedented concentration of forces without resolving tactical constraints. Coalition requirements and logistical capacity narrowed the range of viable operational choices. The Somme emerged as the sector where these conditions converged. The battle that followed reflected the cumulative effects of operational outcomes, logistical capacity, and alliance coordination developed between 1914 and early 1916. By late 1915, military operations on the Western Front were conducted within the constraints imposed by coalition warfare. Strategy, timing, and resource allocation were determined through coordination among Allied states with unequal manpower reserves, industrial output, and levels of operational exhaustion. Decisions taken during this period reflected these constraints and shaped the distribution of offensive responsibility during 1916. Throughout 1914 and most of 1915, France remained the principal land combatant against German forces in the West. French armies occupied the majority of the Western Front and conducted repeated large-scale offensives intended to restore operational mobility. These operations required continuous commitment of trained infantry, artillery crews, and staff elements. Losses accumulated steadily. By the end of 1915, French military records indicate total casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, exceeding 2 million since August 1914, the majority incurred on the Western Front. Replacement systems provided numerical reinforcement but did not fully restore the proportion of pre-war trained personnel. British participation expanded during the same period but remained smaller in scale. In August 1914, Britain deployed a professional expeditionary force of approximately 6 infantry divisions, totaling about 120,000 men. During 1915, Britain raised additional formations through mass voluntary enlistment, followed by the introduction of conscription in January 1916. By the end of 1915, multiple British armies were deployed in France, though many units had limited combat experience and incomplete integration at higher command levels. This disparity in force composition was reflected in Allied planning outcomes. French command staff possessed extensive operational experience gained during repeated offensive attempts under trench conditions. British command staff controlled expanding manpower and industrial resources. Inter-Allied planning documents from 1915 show increasing British allocation of manpower and material to future offensive sectors, while French planning emphasized the conservation and rotation of experienced units. Inter-Allied conferences held during 1915 addressed the coordination of operations across multiple fronts. Meeting records and subsequent staff directives emphasized synchronized action to prevent German redeployment between theaters. Rather than independent national offensives, Allied planning increasingly focused on simultaneous pressure applied across the Western Front and other theaters. Initial concepts for a major Western Front offensive in 1916 assumed substantial French and British participation. Planning documents produced in mid to late 1915 assigned French forces a significant share of infantry and artillery for the operation. Preparatory measures, including artillery procurement and railway expansion, were coordinated on this basis. These assumptions were altered by developments in early 1916. In February, German forces initiated a large-scale offensive against Verdun. The operation expanded rapidly. The French High Command committed successive divisions and artillery units to the sector. Railway traffic and supply systems were redirected to support continuous reinforcement and rotation. By March 1916, a significant proportion of French heavy artillery was committed to Verdun, and multiple divisions originally designated for offensive preparation elsewhere were deployed defensively. The redirection of resources reduced French availability for large-scale offensive operations in other sectors. Planning schedules were adjusted accordingly. No formal cancellation of previously discussed offensive concepts occurred, but operational assignments were revised to reflect the concentration of French forces at Verdun. British capacity for offensive action increased during the same period. British artillery production expanded markedly following earlier shortages. War Office production figures indicate a several-fold increase in shell output between early 1915 and late 1915, accompanied by the introduction of additional heavy artillery formations. Port facilities, rail transport, and forward supply depots were expanded to support sustained operations. Medical and engineering services grew in parallel. Manpower availability reinforced these developments. British training establishments produced large numbers of infantrymen, gunners, and technical specialists throughout 1915. Conscription was introduced in January 1916 to ensure a continued replacement flow. While training standards varied, numerical availability was sufficient to support prolonged offensive deployment without immediate depletion of reserves. Operational responsibility adjusted through documented changes in force assignment. British formations were allocated increasing frontage in sectors designated for offensive action. French participation in these sectors was reduced in scale, but maintained through artillery support and localized infantry deployment. These adjustments were implemented through revised orders of battle and deployment schedules rather than public declaration. The selection of operational sectors reflected these assignments. Areas where British and French armies met were favored, as they allowed concentration of British forces while maintaining French participation without large-scale redeployment. Infrastructure in these sectors supported shared logistical use, including ammunition depots, railheads, and medical facilities. German operational dispositions influenced Allied calculations. Intelligence summaries compiled in early 1916 reported increased German concentration at Verdun and corresponding reductions in activity elsewhere. Aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogation provided partial confirmation of these movements. While incomplete, these reports were incorporated into Allied planning assessments. By mid-1916, the operational distribution within the Allied coalition had shifted measurably. French forces remained heavily engaged in defensive operations. British forces constituted the majority of units designated for large-scale offensive deployment outside the Verdun sector. This distribution was reflected in force strength tables, artillery allocations, and command assignments. Strategic objectives remained unchanged. Allied planning continued to emphasize sustained pressure, limitation of German operational flexibility, and exploitation of industrial capacity over time. What changed was the allocation of effort required to pursue these objectives. Planning mechanisms translated this allocation into operational readiness. Staff officers coordinated artillery groupings, transport schedules, and unit rotations. Command relationships were formalized through written directives to ensure unified control within designated sectors. Communication procedures were standardized to reduce friction between national forces operating in proximity. Throughout this process, coalition coordination remained continuous. Decisions reflected documented constraints imposed by manpower availability, industrial output, and battlefield commitments rather than unilateral preference. No single Allied power acted independently of the others. By early summer 1916, these adjustments were in effect. British forces were prepared to deploy the majority of manpower and artillery in a major Western Front offensive, supported by French units within available limits. The shift of burden resulted from documented battlefield commitments, production capacity, and alliance coordination. It determined the scale and composition of the operations that followed. During the winter of 1915 to 1916, British operational planning for a major offensive on the Western Front proceeded through established staff structures. Planning documents, training manuals, and operational orders from this period define the framework within which artillery, infantry, logistics, and command systems were prepared for large-scale action. British doctrine before 1914 had been developed for a professional army intended for limited expeditionary warfare. Pre-war training emphasized controlled movement, fire discipline, and coordination between infantry and artillery at a relatively small scale. Between 1914 and 1916, the British Army expanded from a professional force of 6 infantry divisions to a mass army comprising dozens of divisions. Many formations created during this expansion contained large proportions of personnel with limited field experience. Operational planning records from late 1915 show that artillery preparation was assigned a central role in overcoming fortified defenses. Fire plans were constructed on the basis that sustained bombardment would damage trench systems, cut wire obstacles, and suppress defending forces before infantry movement. This approach reflected the availability of increased numbers of guns and ammunition compared with earlier campaigns. British artillery strength on the Western Front expanded during 1915. The number of medium and heavy guns increased substantially, and additional artillery brigades were formed. Ammunition production rose sharply following earlier shortages, allowing planners to allocate sustained fire programs measured in days rather than hours. Planning tables specified ammunition expenditure rates, target sequences, and timing for each artillery group assigned to the operation. Artillery fire plans distributed effort across successive defensive positions, including frontline trenches, support lines, communication trenches, and identified strongpoints. Counter-battery tasks were included to reduce enemy artillery activity during infantry movement. These plans assumed that scheduled fire and observed effects would reduce defensive fire during the opening phase of the assault. Infantry assault procedures were defined in operational orders issued to divisions and brigades. Units were instructed to advance in successive lines, maintaining alignment and prescribed intervals. Movement rates were calculated to coincide with the lifting and shifting of artillery fire. Control was emphasized to ensure that units reached assigned objectives according to the timetable rather than reacting independently to local conditions. Infantry roles during the initial assault were limited in scope. Orders directed attacking troops to occupy designated trench lines and consolidate positions. Prolonged independent engagement beyond initial objectives was not anticipated in the opening phase. Reserve units were designated for later commitment according to prearranged schedules. Command and communication arrangements relied primarily on fixed systems established before the attack. Field telephone networks were laid in advance to connect headquarters with subordinate units. Runners and visual signals supplemented these systems. Wireless communication was available in limited quantities and was not relied upon for continuous control during the assault. Planning documents emphasize adherence to the timetable to reduce reliance on real-time communication. Intelligence summaries compiled during late 1915 and early 1916 identified German trench networks, wire obstacles, and machine gun positions. Aerial reconnaissance and photographic interpretation improved mapping accuracy. Reports noted the presence of dugouts, but did not consistently identify their depth or structural reinforcement. Assessment of bombardment effectiveness before infantry movement relied on projected fire effects rather than direct confirmation. Terrain and weather considerations were included in planning schedules. Winter conditions delayed projected operations and extended the preparation period. By early spring 1916, planners anticipated firmer ground suitable for the movement of infantry and artillery. Engineering units were tasked with road improvement, tramway construction, and preparation of forward supply routes. Logistical preparation was extensive. Railheads were expanded, ammunition depots established, and road networks improved to support sustained artillery fire and troop movement. Medical planning accounted for large casualty volumes through the establishment of casualty clearing stations and evacuation routes. Engineering and labor units prepared materials for trench construction and consolidation. Training programs implemented during this period focused on the execution of assigned tasks. Divisional and brigade exercises emphasized movement and formation, adherence to objectives, consolidation of captured ground, and cooperation with artillery schedules. Training directives prioritized discipline and control to maintain cohesion among newly formed units. Operational orders included provisions for continuation of the offensive beyond the initial assault. Reserve formations were assigned follow-on roles with defined readiness times. Timetables specified when reserves would advance to occupy objectives or reinforce forward units. These arrangements were recorded in planning schedules rather than left to discretionary decision during the operation. Objectives were defined in depth. Each phase of the operation was assigned specific terrain features and trench lines to be occupied. Progress was measured by the occupation and consolidation of these objectives rather than by the destruction of enemy forces as a separate measure. Staff coordination encompassed artillery, infantry, engineers, transport, and medical services. Written orders specified responsibilities at each level of command. The scale of coordination reflected the number of formations involved and the volume of material to be employed. Casualties were anticipated and incorporated into planning for medical evacuation and reinforcement. Replacement systems were prepared to supply additional personnel as required. Planning documents do not indicate an expectation of negligible losses during the opening phase, but casualty estimates were framed within assumptions of reduced defensive fire following bombardment. Centralized planning was reinforced by the Army's composition. Many units lacked long-established non-commissioned officer cadres capable of decentralized action under fire. Operational control, therefore, relied on prearranged orders, schedules, and objectives. By the beginning of 1916, German defensive preparations on the Western Front had reached a level of depth and complexity that reflected more than 18 months of continuous adaptation under fire. These preparations were not uniform across the front, but were shaped by terrain, available labor, engineering resources, and accumulated battlefield experience. In the Somme sector, German forces constructed a defensive system designed to absorb sustained artillery bombardment and to maintain combat effectiveness during and after an attack. German defensive doctrine by this stage of the war emphasized positional resilience rather than rigid forward defense. The purpose of the frontline trench was not to serve as the sole line of resistance, but as part of a layered system intended to delay, disrupt, and channel attacking forces. Behind the front line, secondary and reserve positions were prepared to continue resistance even if the foremost trenches were penetrated. The frontline trench in the Somme sector typically consisted of a fire trench positioned to provide direct observation and fields of fire over no man's land. This trench was supported by parapets reinforced with sandbags, timber, and revetments. Fire steps were constructed to allow infantry to engage attackers while remaining partially protected. Firing positions were often staggered rather than continuous, reducing vulnerability to enfilade fire. Behind the front line, support trenches were constructed at varying distances, often between 50 and 200 meters to the rear. These trenches allowed units to withdraw temporarily during bombardment and reoccupy forward positions once fire lifted. Communication trenches linked these positions, enabling the movement of troops, ammunition, and supplies under cover. The density of these communication routes increased steadily during 1915. Reserve trenches were positioned further back, sometimes several hundred meters behind the front line. These positions served as rally points for counterattack units and as fallback defenses in the event of penetration. In many areas of the Somme sector, these reserve lines were less visible to aerial observation and therefore less frequently targeted by artillery fire. A critical component of the German defensive system was the dugout. By 1916, German dugouts in the Somme region were constructed at significant depth, often between 6 and 10 meters below ground level. These shelters were reinforced with timber frames, steel supports, and, in some cases, concrete. Access was provided by stairways or sloped tunnels designed to minimize blast effects. Dugouts were intended to shelter infantry, machine gun crews, and command elements during bombardment. The depth and construction of these dugouts reflected direct experience of Allied artillery capabilities. Earlier shallow shelters had proven inadequate. By late 1915, German engineering units devoted extensive labor to deepening and strengthening shelters. In chalk and clay soils common in the Somme area, excavation was labor-intensive but feasible. Spoil removal was conducted at night to reduce detection. Machine gun deployment formed another essential element of the defensive system. German units emphasized the use of machine guns as the primary means of inflicting casualties on attacking infantry. Guns were sighted to cover no man's land with overlapping fields of fire. Positions were often placed in reinforced emplacements slightly behind the front line rather than directly in it, increasing survivability during bombardment. Machine gun crews trained to reoccupy firing positions rapidly once artillery fire lifted. Pre-registered firing data allowed immediate engagement of advancing infantry. In many cases, guns were positioned to fire obliquely across expected lines of advance rather than directly forward, maximizing coverage and reducing vulnerability to direct fire. Barbed wire obstacles were integrated into the defensive scheme. Wire entanglements were constructed in belts of varying depth, often extending several meters forward of the frontline trench. These obstacles were designed to slow infantry movement, break up formations, and expose attackers to machine gun and rifle fire. The wire was anchored securely and repaired frequently, particularly after artillery damage. The effectiveness of wire obstacles depended on maintenance. German units assigned working parties to inspect and repair wire regularly, often under the cover of darkness. In sectors considered likely targets for attack, wire density was increased over time. Where terrain allowed, wire belts were arranged irregularly to complicate clearance by artillery or infantry. Artillery support formed the final layer of the defensive system. German artillery units were positioned to provide defensive fire across likely avenues of approach. Guns were sighted in concealed positions, often behind reverse slopes or within wooded areas, reducing vulnerability to counter-battery fire. Forward observers and sound-ranging units supported artillery response. Defensive fire plans were prepared in advance. Artillery units registered targets in no man's land and along trench lines, enabling rapid response during an attack. Fire could be called down to isolate penetrations, disrupt consolidation, and support counterattacks. This integration of artillery with infantry defense increased the system's resilience. Counterattack doctrine was closely linked to defensive architecture. German planning emphasized rapid local counterattacks to restore lost ground before attackers could consolidate. Reserve units were held in readiness in rear positions, with routes prepared for movement forward. The trench network facilitated this movement by providing covered approaches. The defensive system also incorporated command and communication arrangements designed to function under bombardment. Command posts were often located in deep dugouts, protected from shell fire. Telephone lines were buried to reduce disruption. Signal flares and runners supplemented communications when lines were cut. While communications were frequently disrupted during heavy bombardment, redundancy improved overall resilience. German defensive preparations in the Somme sector were influenced by the terrain. The rolling landscape provided limited natural cover, but allowed for effective observation from elevated positions. Villages and wooded areas were incorporated into defensive planning as strongpoints. Buildings were reinforced or adapted for defense, and cellars were converted into shelters or firing positions. Labor availability played a role in the development of defenses. German units employed both military labor and, in some cases, civilian or prisoner labor for construction tasks. Engineering units supervised large-scale works, while infantry units contributed manpower during periods of relative quiet. Defensive construction continued throughout 1915 and into 1916, with improvements ongoing up to the eve of the Allied offensive. The cumulative effect of these preparations was the creation of a defensive system capable of absorbing prolonged artillery bombardment without complete destruction. Frontline positions could be temporarily abandoned during a fire and reoccupied afterward. Deep shelters preserved manpower. Machine gun positions remained capable of immediate action. Reserve lines and counterattack forces provided depth. German defensive architecture was not static. Adjustments were made in response to Allied actions observed elsewhere on the front. Lessons from earlier battles informed construction standards and tactical arrangements. By early 1916, German defenses represented a synthesis of engineering, firepower, and doctrine shaped by continuous engagement. The Somme sector was not regarded as uniquely fortified compared to other parts of the front, but its defenses met the general standard achieved by German forces by that time. The system relied on depth, dispersion, and rapid reoccupation rather than on the invulnerability of any single position. These defensive arrangements defined the conditions under which any assault in the Somme sector would take place. They determined how artillery fire would be absorbed, how infantry would be engaged, and how ground would be contested during and after an attack. The defensive architecture in place before July 1916 was the product of sustained effort, accumulated experience, and institutional adaptation within the German army. The interaction between attacking forces and this defensive system would depend not on the existence of defenses alone, but on how effectively they were engaged, suppressed, or bypassed. By late June 1916, artillery preparation formed the central operational instrument intended to shape the conditions for the opening assault. The preparatory bombardment conducted between June 24th and July 1st, 1916 was unprecedented in scale for the British Army and reflected both material expansion and doctrinal reliance on firepower as the primary means of overcoming fortified defenses. Artillery doctrine at this stage emphasized destruction, neutralization, and suppression. The bombardment was expected to achieve several defined effects: to cut barbed wire obstacles, collapse or damage trench systems, destroy machine gun positions, neutralize defending infantry, and suppress enemy artillery sufficiently to allow attacking troops to advance with reduced exposure to fire. These objectives were embedded in formal artillery instructions and operational orders issued to corps and divisional commands. The artillery deployed for the bombardment represented a substantial concentration of guns. British forces assembled thousands of pieces across the Somme sector, including field guns, howitzers, and heavy artillery. Field guns provided rapid fire against wire and surface targets, while heavier calibers were tasked with destroying dugouts, strongpoints, and rear positions. French artillery units operating in adjacent sectors contributed additional firepower, coordinated through joint planning arrangements. Ammunition expenditure was calculated to sustain continuous fire over multiple days. British production and stockpiling efforts during 1915 and early 1916 made such expenditure possible. Estimates compiled after the battle indicate that approximately 1.7 million shells were fired during the preparatory period. This figure included a mix of shell types and calibers, reflecting both doctrinal intent and limitations in available munitions. Shell composition played a critical role in the effectiveness of the bombardment. A significant proportion of shells allocated to wire-cutting tasks were shrapnel rather than high-explosive rounds. Shrapnel shells, designed to burst in the air and scatter fragments, were effective against exposed troops but limited in their ability to destroy thick wire entanglements or earthworks. High-explosive shells were more effective against structures but were in shorter supply relative to demand. Fusing technology further constrained results. Many shells were fitted with fuses that detonated on impact or after minimal delay. Against deep dugouts and reinforced positions, such detonation often failed to transmit destructive force into shelters below ground. In some cases, defective fuses resulted in shells failing to detonate at all, reducing the cumulative effect of sustained fire. Targeting accuracy varied across the front. Artillery observers relied on maps, aerial photographs, and pre-registered firing data to direct fire. While aerial reconnaissance had improved the mapping of trench systems, limitations remained. Concealed positions, particularly machine gun emplacements located behind forward trenches or within reverse slopes, were difficult to identify and engage effectively. Weather conditions and smoke further reduced observation during the bombardment. The bombardment was conducted according to a structured schedule. Fire plans allocated specific time blocks to different target categories. Initial phases emphasized wire cutting and destruction of frontline trenches. Subsequent phases shifted focus to deeper positions and suspected reserve areas. Counter-battery fire was assigned to selected artillery groups tasked with locating and suppressing enemy guns. Counter-battery operations faced inherent challenges. German artillery positions were often concealed and dispersed. Sound ranging and flash spotting techniques were employed to locate enemy batteries, but these methods were still developing and subject to error. As a result, many German guns remained operational throughout the bombardment, albeit under intermittent fire. The duration of the bombardment was intended to compensate for these limitations. British planners assumed that sustained fire over 7 days would cumulatively degrade defenses even if individual strikes were imperfect. The extended duration was also intended to exhaust defenders physically and psychologically, reducing their ability to respond effectively once the infantry assault began. The weather affected the bombardment in several ways. Periods of rain delayed the start of operations and interfered with observation. Ground conditions limited the movement of guns and ammunition in forward areas. Adjustments were made to firing schedules as conditions changed, but overall tempo was maintained. German forces adapted their behavior to the bombardment. Frontline trenches were often vacated during intense fire, with troops sheltering in deep dugouts or withdrawing temporarily to support positions. This practice reduced casualties during the bombardment itself, but preserved combat capability for later phases. Once the fire lifted or shifted, defenders were able to reoccupy firing positions rapidly. Wire obstacles, a primary target of the bombardment, were unevenly affected. In some sectors, concentrated high-explosive fire successfully cut lanes through entanglements. In others, the wire remained largely intact, either because shrapnel shells were ineffective or because fire was insufficiently concentrated. Variability in results reflected differences in gun density, ammunition type, and targeting accuracy. Trench destruction also varied. Shallow trenches and parapets were often damaged or collapsed. Deeper trenches and reinforced sections remained functional. Dugouts constructed at depth frequently survived intact, allowing defenders to remain protected during the bombardment. The collapse of surface features did not necessarily translate into loss of defensive capability. Machine gun positions proved particularly resistant. Guns placed in reinforced emplacements or located behind the forward trench line were often unaffected by surface bombardment. Crews sheltered during the fire and prepared to man weapons once the bombardment lifted. The survivability of these positions had significant implications for the infantry assault. The bombardment imposed heavy logistical demands. Continuous firing required an uninterrupted ammunition supply. Railheads, roads, and tramways operated at high capacity to move shells forward. Ammunition dumps were established close to gun positions, increasing vulnerability to counter-battery fire and accidents. Artillery units managed rates of fire to balance effectiveness with barrel wear and ammunition availability. Medical and engineering services were engaged during the bombardment period. Accidental detonations, counter-battery fire, and the strain of continuous operations produced casualties among artillery crews. Repair of gun platforms, communications, and supply routes was ongoing. Despite these challenges, the bombardment was sustained largely as planned. Command assessment of bombardment effectiveness relied on indirect indicators. Reports from artillery observers, aerial photographs, and limited patrols informed judgments about wire destruction and trench damage. These assessments were inherently uncertain. Direct confirmation of enemy condition was not possible on a broad scale before the infantry advanced. As the final days of the bombardment approached, adjustments were made to fire plans. Some sectors received intensified fire in response to reports of intact wire or suspected strongpoints. In other areas, ammunition shortages or gun were limited additional concentration. The overall schedule, however, remained fixed to align with the planned assault date. The bombardment concluded on the morning of July 1, 1916, with artillery fire shifting forward and lifting according to prearranged timetables. This transition marked the shift from preparatory fire to assault support. The extent to which the bombardment had achieved its objectives varied significantly along the front. In certain areas, defenses were visibly damaged, and the wire had been cut sufficiently to permit movement. In many others, critical elements of the defensive system remained intact. Deep shelters preserved manpower. Machine gun positions remained capable of immediate action. German artillery, though suppressed intermittently, was not neutralized. The preparatory bombardment represented a decisive commitment to firepower as the primary instrument of attack. It reflected the British Army's material expansion and confidence in sustained artillery application. At the same time, it exposed the technical and doctrinal limitations inherent in existing artillery methods, ammunition quality, and intelligence. The 7-day bombardment set the physical conditions under which the opening assault would take place. Its effects were uneven and sector-dependent. The interaction between bombardment results and the surviving defensive system would shape events once the infantry crossed no man's land. At 7:30 on July 1st, 1916, infantry assaults began along a front of approximately 40 kilometers extending from the vicinity of Serra in the north to the Somme River in the south. The opening attack was conducted primarily by British forces, with French units advancing on the southern flank. The assault followed the completion of the preparatory bombardment and was executed according to prearranged timetables and sector-specific orders. Immediately before the infantry advance, artillery fire lifted or shifted forward in accordance with operational schedules. In many sectors, artillery continued to fire on secondary targets while infantry crossed no man's land. Infantry units emerged from their trenches carrying full combat loads, including rifles, ammunition, tools, rations, and equipment for consolidation. Advance formations varied by unit, but generally followed prescribed wave structures intended to maintain control and alignment. The nature of no man's land differed by sector. In some areas, the distance between opposing trenches was less than 200 meters. In others, it exceeded 400 meters. Terrain conditions were uneven, marked by shell craters, broken ground, and remnants of wire obstacles. Visibility varied due to smoke, dust, and haze produced by the bombardment. In the southern sectors, where French forces operated alongside British units, progress was more substantial. French artillery preparation had been shorter but more concentrated, employing a higher proportion of heavy guns and high explosive ammunition. French infantry advanced behind closely coordinated fire and encountered reduced resistance in several areas. Multiple German frontline positions were captured during the morning, and advances reached assigned objectives in depth. British experiences varied widely by sector. In some areas, particularly in the south near Montauban, British divisions achieved limited success. Infantry units captured portions of the German frontline system and advanced into secondary positions. German resistance in these sectors was disrupted, and consolidation began during the day. In other sectors, especially north of the Albert, Bapaume Road, the assault met immediate and sustained resistance. German machine gun fire opened as infantry advanced, often within minutes of leaving their trenches. In many cases, wire obstacles remained intact, slowing or halting progress and forcing units to bunch together under fire. Casualties mounted rapidly. German defenders emerged from deep dugouts as the bombardment lifted. Machine gun crews manned prepared positions and delivered fire across no man's land. Guns sighted to fire obliquely covered multiple avenues of approach. Rifle fire supplemented machine guns where visibility allowed. Artillery fire was brought down on advancing troops and assembly areas once German observers identified movement. Communications began to fail early in the assault. Field telephone lines were cut by shell fire, and runners encountered difficulty crossing exposed ground. Visual signals were often obscured by smoke and dust. As a result, higher command received limited and delayed information about progress or failure in forward areas. In the northernmost sectors, attacks against positions near Serra and Beaumont-Hamel encountered particularly strong resistance. German defenses in these areas were largely intact. Infantry units advancing in prescribed formations were engaged by concentrated fire almost immediately. In several instances, units suffered heavy losses before reaching the German wire. Few penetrations were achieved, and survivors sought cover in shell holes or attempted to withdraw under fire. At Beaumont-Hamel, attacking units faced steeply rising ground and well-sighted machine gun positions. German fire swept the approaches, and advances stalled within minutes. Attempts to renew the attack during the morning and afternoon resulted in additional casualties without significant gain. Further south, attacks near Thiepval also encountered intact defenses. German positions on elevated ground provided commanding observation. Machine gun fire from fortified strongpoints halted advances across wide fronts. Penetration of the front line was limited and could not be exploited. In contrast, sectors south of the Albert, Bapaume Road demonstrated partial success. At Montauban, British forces captured the village and surrounding positions by midday. Coordination with French units on the right facilitated this advance. Gains in this area extended to depths of more than 1 kilometer in places, representing some of the most successful advances of the day. Throughout the day, British commanders attempted to reinforce success and address failure within the limits imposed by communications and terrain. Reserve units were committed in some sectors according to prearranged schedules. In areas of heavy resistance, orders to press on or renew attacks were issued based on incomplete information. German countermeasures were organized rapidly. Local reserves moved forward through communication trenches to reinforce threatened positions. Artillery fire was adjusted to isolate penetrations and disrupt consolidation. Counterattacks were launched where feasible, particularly against shallow or isolated gains. By midday, it was evident that outcomes varied sharply across the front. In some sectors, attacking units held portions of the German trench system and began consolidation. In others, assaults had failed with heavy loss and no territorial gain. The unevenness of results reflected differences in artillery effectiveness, defensive strength, terrain, and coordination. Casualty accumulation was severe. British units engaged in the assault suffered losses at a scale unprecedented in a single day. By nightfall, British casualties totaled approximately 57,000, including around 19,000 killed, with the remainder wounded or missing. These figures represent combined losses across all engaged sectors and units. French casualties on the same day were significantly lower, reflecting differences in artillery preparation, tactical approach, and sectors attacked. French advances achieved their initial objectives in several areas, and consolidation proceeded during the afternoon and evening. As daylight faded, fighting continued in contested areas. Units attempted to reorganize, evacuate wounded, and establish defensive positions. German artillery maintained fire on captured ground and assembly areas. Medical services worked continuously to move casualties from forward positions under difficult conditions. By the end of the day, the front line reflected the mixed results of the assault. In the south, Allied forces held ground beyond the original German front line. In central and northern sectors, the line remained largely unchanged. German defenses had been penetrated in limited areas but not broken on a broad front. Command assessments compiled during the evening relied on fragmentary reports. In many cases, headquarters lacked a clear understanding of the exact location or condition of forward units. Decisions regarding continuation or adjustment of operations were deferred pending consolidation and clarification. Between the 1st and the 3rd of July 1916, the immediate causes of failure in large portions of the opening assault became operationally visible. These causes were not speculative and did not depend on retrospective judgment. They emerged directly from the interaction of artillery effects, defensive survivability, infantry movement, communication systems, terrain, and the tempo of German response during and immediately after the assault. One determining mechanism was the uneven effect of artillery fire on defensive infrastructure. While surface trenches and parapets were damaged in many areas, deep shelters remained intact across much of the front. German dugouts constructed at depths sufficient to withstand prolonged bombardment preserved infantry, machine gun crews, and command elements. As artillery fire lifted, defenders were able to reoccupy firing positions within minutes. This survivability ensured that defensive fire was available at the moment attacking infantry entered no man's land. Wire obstacles constituted a second critical mechanism. Artillery fire intended to cut the wire produced inconsistent results. In sectors where high explosive fire was concentrated, lanes were created. In many other sectors, wire belts remained largely intact. Infantry encountering uncut wire were forced to slow, bunch, or seek gaps under fire. This loss of momentum exposed attackers to sustain machine gun and rifle fire for extended periods. Machine gun employment amplified these effects. German machine guns were sighted to fire across expected avenues of approach, often obliquely rather than directly forward. Guns positioned behind the front line or within reinforced emplacements survived bombardment. Pre-registered firing data enabled immediate engagement once targets appeared. The concentration of fire on constrained approaches multiplied casualty rates among advancing units. Infantry assault methods interacted with these defensive conditions. Attacking units advanced according to prescribed formations intended to maintain control and alignment. Movement rates were fixed to artillery schedules rather than adjusted to real-time conditions. Where resistance was heavier than anticipated, these formations limited the ability of individuals or small groups to alter direction, disperse, or seek alternative routes. Units encountering intact wire or heavy fire were unable to maneuver effectively without orders that could not be transmitted in time. Communications failure compounded these difficulties. Field telephone lines laid before the assault were frequently cut by shell fire. Runners attempting to carry messages across open ground were delayed or killed. Visual signals were obscured by smoke and dust. As a result, higher command often lacked timely information regarding the condition of forward units. Decisions to reinforce, halt, or redirect attacks were made with incomplete situational awareness. Reserve employment was constrained by both planning and physical conditions. Reserve units were committed according to prearranged schedules that assumed forward progress. In sectors where the assault stalled early, reserves advancing on time encountered the same fire and obstacles as the initial waves. In other areas, reserves could not be committed rapidly due to congestion in communication trenches, damaged routes, and uncertainty regarding forward positions. The German artillery response constituted another decisive mechanism. Despite counter-battery efforts during the bombardment, many German guns remained operational. Once infantry movement was observed, artillery fire was brought down on assembly areas, no man's land, and captured trenches. This fire disrupted reinforcement, inflicted additional casualties, and hindered consolidation. The ability to deliver defensive artillery fire in depth limited the sustainability of initial penetrations. Local counterattack doctrine further shaped outcomes. German reserves positioned in rear trenches and support areas moved forward through protected routes once attacks were identified. Counterattacks were launched against shallow penetrations before attackers could consolidate. In sectors where Allied advances were limited in depth, these countermeasures restored defensive lines within hours. Terrain influenced the effectiveness of all these mechanisms. Elevated German positions provided observation over approaches. Valleys and shallow slopes exposed advancing infantry to enfilade fire. Shell-torn ground slowed movement and reduced cohesion. In contrast, sectors with more favorable ground or where artillery effects were stronger experienced comparatively better results. Timing also mattered. The lifting of artillery fire followed rigid schedules. In some sectors, fire was lifted too early, exposing infantry before they reached enemy trenches. In others, delays caused confusion and disrupted coordination. Adjusting these schedules once the assault began proved difficult due to communication breakdowns. The cumulative effect of these mechanisms became evident over the first 3 days. Initial penetrations achieved on July 1st were difficult to expand. Attacks renewed on the 2nd and the 3rd of July encountered reinforced defenses and continued artillery fire. Losses accumulated without corresponding territorial gain in many sectors. Where progress was made, it was limited and costly. These outcomes were not the result of a single failure point. They reflected the convergence of multiple interacting systems operating under battlefield conditions. Artillery effects, while extensive, were insufficiently decisive against deep defenses. Infantry methods emphasized control over adaptability. Communications systems failed under sustained fire. German defensive responses functioned as intended. By July 3, 1916, it was operationally clear that a large-scale breakthrough had not been achieved across most of the front. The mechanisms responsible were observable and documented in unit reports, casualty returns, and after-action assessments compiled during the period. These records describe intact wire, surviving machine gun positions, disrupted communications, and rapid defensive response as recurring factors. The opening phase demonstrated that success depended on precise alignment of firepower, movement, terrain, and timing. Where these factors coincided favorably, limited advances occurred. Where they did not, assaults failed at high cost. The distribution of outcomes across the front reflected differences in these conditions rather than uniform performance or intent. Between the 1st and the 3rd of July, the operational environment shifted. German defenses adjusted to confirmed attack patterns. Allied units reorganized under fire. The initial assumption that preparatory fire alone would neutralize resistance was not borne out in practice. Subsequent actions would be shaped by the need to address these observed mechanisms within the constraints imposed by terrain, logistics, and available forces. During July 1916, large-scale combat along the Somme front continued despite the outcomes of the opening assault. Operations conducted throughout the month were shaped by existing force deployments, logistical commitments, and the operational reality established during the first days of fighting. The continuation of the offensive was not marked by a single renewed assault, but by a sequence of localized attacks, adjustments in frontage, and sustained pressure applied across multiple sectors. Following the initial assault, British forces reorganized under fire. Units that had suffered heavy losses were withdrawn or reorganized, while less engaged formations were moved forward. Replacement drafts were brought up from depots to restore depleted battalions. Casualty clearing stations operated continuously, evacuating wounded from forward areas under persistent artillery fire. Rail and road networks were heavily utilized to sustain troop movement, supply ammunition, and support medical evacuation. Operational activity during early July focused on consolidating ground gained in limited sectors and attempting to extend these gains laterally. In areas where frontline German positions had been captured, British units worked to strengthen defenses, repair trenches, and establish supply routes. Engineering units constructed communication trenches and improved routes across shell-damaged ground to enable the movement of reinforcements and supplies. German forces responded by reinforcing threatened sectors. Divisions were moved laterally along the front and committed to countering Allied advances. Artillery fire was adjusted to target newly occupied positions and assembly areas. Defensive positions were repaired or reconstructed rapidly, often under cover of darkness. The defensive system retained coherence despite localized disruption. Combat during the first half of July was characterized by repeated attacks against specific objectives rather than broad front assaults. British operations targeted villages, trench systems, and ridgelines that offered tactical advantage. These attacks were preceded by shorter, more focused artillery bombardments compared to the preparatory fire of late June. Infantry advances were typically limited in scope and intended to secure defined positions rather than achieve deep penetration. One major objective during this period was the capture of ground overlooking key routes and defensive positions. Elevated terrain provided observation and facilitated artillery coordination. Attacks against such objectives were conducted incrementally, with gains measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. Progress depended on the ability to suppress machine gun fire and neutralize localized strongpoints. German resistance remained intense. Machine gun fire and artillery continued to inflict heavy casualties on advancing troops. Counterattacks were launched to regain lost ground or disrupt consolidation. The tempo of combat fluctuated, with periods of intense fighting followed by pauses for reorganization and resupply. Artillery remained central to operations. British gun density increased in some sectors as additional batteries were brought forward. Ammunition expenditure remained high, with sustained firing placing strain on supply systems and gun barrels. Counter-battery efforts continued, though German artillery remained capable of effective defensive fire. Weather conditions during July influenced operations. Dry periods allowed movement across damaged ground, but also increased dust, reducing visibility. Occasional rain worsened ground conditions locally, complicating movement and supply. Heat affected troops operating in exposed positions, increased physical strain. The scale of casualties during July remained high. British units engaged in repeated attacks experienced steady losses. Casualty figures for the month added significantly to those incurred on the opening day. German forces also sustained losses as a result of continuous engagement and counterattacks, though precise figures varied by sector and unit. French forces on the southern flank continued operations in coordination with British units. French advances during July consolidated earlier gains and applied pressure on German defenses. Artillery cooperation between Allied forces supported localized offensives and defensive efforts. French sectors generally experienced more consistent progress due to differences in terrain, artillery employment, and defensive conditions. Command decisions during July reflected the need to maintain pressure while adapting tactics to observed conditions. Orders emphasized coordination between infantry and artillery, improved wire cutting, and more concentrated fire on identified strongpoints. Assault objectives were refined to reflect the difficulty of advancing beyond initial defenses. Communication remained a persistent challenge. Telephone lines were frequently disrupted by shell fire, requiring constant repair. Runners and visual signals continued to supplement communications, though effectiveness varied. Commanders often relied on delayed or incomplete reports when making decisions. Logistical demands intensified as operations continued. Ammunition consumption required continuous resupply. Food, water, and equipment had to be delivered across shell-torn terrain. Medical services operated under strain as casualty numbers remained high. Engineering units worked to maintain infrastructure under fire. German defensive adaptation continued throughout the month. Defensive positions were deepened and reinforced where possible. Machine gun placements were adjusted based on observed Allied attack patterns. Artillery fire plans were refined to target assembly areas and likely avenues of advance. The defensive system remained functional despite sustained pressure. By mid-July, the character of the fighting had become increasingly attritional. Advances were limited and costly. Attacks aimed to reduce German strength and secure tactically advantageous positions rather than achieve an immediate operational breakthrough. The front line shifted gradually in certain sectors, while remaining static in others. Operational reports compiled during the month recorded incremental gains and losses. These reports documented the difficulty of advancing against prepared defenses and the high cost of repeated assaults. They also recorded instances of successful coordination and localized penetration, though such successes were not uniform. The persistence of operations during July was shaped by the absence of viable alternatives. Forces were committed, logistics established, and command structures oriented toward continued action. Adjustments were made within this framework rather than abandoning it. The scale of the operation required sustained engagement to justify the concentration of men and material. By the end of July 1916, the battlefield reflected weeks of continuous fighting. Trench systems had been altered or destroyed in places, new positions constructed, and ground contested repeatedly. Casualties had accumulated on both sides. The offensive had not achieved a decisive breakthrough, but it had altered the disposition of forces and the condition of the battlefield. During August 1916, combat along the Somme front entered a phase defined by sustained engagement against fortified positions with limited territorial movement. Operations conducted throughout the month were characterized by repeated attacks against specific tactical objectives, continuous artillery fire, and steady casualty accumulation on both sides. The conduct of operations reflected the operational environment established during July and the condition of forces engaged along the front. At the beginning of August, Allied forces held a series of shallow gains in several sectors. These positions were irregular in shape and exposed to observation and fire from adjacent German-held ground. Consolidation work continued, including the repair of captured trenches, the construction of communication routes, and the establishment of supply points. Engineering units labored under fire to stabilize positions and enable the continued movement of men and material. German forces maintained a coherent defensive system despite earlier losses. Defensive lines were adjusted locally, and additional positions were constructed behind the front. Machine gun placements were repositioned to cover newly contested ground. Artillery units recalibrated defensive fire plans to reflect changes in the front line and the pattern of Allied attacks. British operations during August focused on capturing tactically advantageous terrain that offered observation, control of movement, or improved artillery coordination. Attacks were generally limited in scope and preceded by concentrated artillery bombardments of shorter duration than those used in June. Objectives included trench systems, fortified farms, villages, and elevated ground that dominated surrounding areas. One of the most contested areas during the month was the high ground near Pozieres and Moquet Farm. This terrain provided commanding observation over German rear areas and supply routes. Fighting in this sector was intense and prolonged. Positions changed hands multiple times as attacks and counterattacks were launched in close succession. Infantry units advanced under heavy artillery and machine gun fire, often at night, to reduce exposure and achieve surprise. Artillery employment remained central. Gun densities increased in certain sectors as additional batteries were brought forward. Ammunition expenditure continued at high levels. Field guns supported infantry assaults and interdicted movement, while heavy artillery targeted strong points, trench junctions, and rear positions. Counter-battery fire remained a constant feature, though German artillery continued to operate effectively. The physical condition of the battlefield deteriorated further. Continuous shelling destroyed surface features, collapsed trenches, and created extensive crater fields. Movement across this terrain was slow and hazardous. Supply routes required constant repair. The effort required to move ammunition, food, water, and medical supplies increased steadily as ground conditions worsened. The weather during August was generally dry, which facilitated movement compared to later months, but increased dust and reduced visibility in some areas. Heat placed additional strain on troops operating in exposed positions. Sanitation conditions deteriorated as bodies, refuse, and damaged infrastructure accumulated in forward areas. Casualties remained high. British units engaged in repeated assaults and defensive holding actions suffered steady losses. German units also sustained significant casualties as a result of continuous bombardment, close-quarter fighting, and counterattacks. Replacement drafts were brought forward to maintain unit strength, though experienced personnel were increasingly scarce. French forces on the southern flank continued operations in coordination with British actions. French units advanced incrementally, securing additional ground and applying pressure on German defenses. Artillery cooperation between Allied forces supported attacks and defensive measures. The southern sectors generally saw more consistent progress due to terrain, artillery concentration, and defensive conditions. Communications challenges persisted. Telephone lines were frequently severed by shell fire. Repair parties worked continuously to restore connections. Runners remained essential for message delivery, but faced heavy risk crossing exposed ground. Delays and information gaps affected the coordination and timing of attacks. Medical services operated under sustained pressure. Casualty clearing stations handled large numbers of wounded daily. Evacuation routes were crowded and vulnerable to artillery fire. Advances in organization and experience improved efficiency, but the volume of casualties remained a constant challenge. German countermeasures during August emphasized rapid local response. Counterattacks were launched to regain lost ground or disrupt Allied consolidation. These actions were supported by artillery fire and coordinated movement through protected routes. In many cases, counterattacks succeeded in halting further advance even when ground was temporarily lost. Operational reports compiled during the month recorded limited territorial gains achieved at high cost. Advances were often measured in tens or hundreds of meters. Positions of tactical value were taken only after repeated assaults. The cumulative effect of these actions was a gradual wearing down of units on both sides rather than a decisive movement of the front. The focus of operations increasingly shifted toward reducing enemy strength through sustained pressure. Artillery fire targeted known positions repeatedly. Infantry attacks aimed to capture or neutralize specific strongpoints rather than penetrate deeply. The tempo of operations was maintained to prevent the defender from reorganizing fully or transferring forces elsewhere. Logistical systems were adapted to support prolonged fighting. Supply schedules were adjusted to ensure continuous ammunition delivery. Engineering resources were concentrated on maintaining routes and positions. The scale of effort required to sustain operations underscored the industrial nature of the conflict. By mid-August, the cumulative strain on both forces was evident. Units were rotated where possible, though relief was often brief. Fatigue affected performance and morale. Commanders faced the challenge of maintaining operational effectiveness while managing depleted and exhausted formations. The end of August did not mark a pause in operations, but a continuation of the established pattern. Ground contested earlier in the month remained under fire. Positions captured at high cost required constant defense. German forces continued to resist effectively despite losses. The fighting during August demonstrated that progress depended on the ability to sustain pressure over time rather than achieve a rapid decision. Each local success required significant resources and incurred heavy casualties. The battlefield environment favored defense, and advances came only through persistent engagement. By the close of the month, the Somme front had been altered incrementally. Certain tactically important positions were held by Allied forces, while others remained in German hands. The operational situation reflected a balance between limited gains and continued resistance. During September 1916, operations along the Somme front reflected a period of tactical adjustment undertaken under continuous combat conditions. Changes in artillery coordination, infantry procedures, and the introduction of new equipment were implemented within existing operational frameworks. These measures altered the conduct of attacks in specific sectors, but did not remove the structural constraints imposed by terrain, defenses, and logistics. Artillery employment during September showed increased emphasis on coordination with infantry movement. Fire plans were refined to provide closer support during assaults. Artillery schedules were adjusted to place sustained fire immediately ahead of advancing troops. reducing the interval between bombardment and infantry movement. This approach sought to limit the time available for defenders to reoccupy firing positions after bombardment. Gun densities increased in selected sectors. Additional batteries were moved forward, and ammunition allocation was concentrated against specific objectives rather than distributed evenly along the front. Heavy artillery continued to target strongpoints, trench junctions, and rear positions, while field guns focused on wire cutting and suppression of frontline defenses. Counter-battery efforts remained ongoing, though German artillery continued to deliver effective fire. Infantry tactics were modified incrementally. Assault units were encouraged to advance in smaller groupings within prescribed formations, allowing limited dispersion while maintaining control. Greater emphasis was placed on the rapid consolidation of captured ground. Units carried additional tools and materials to strengthen positions immediately after capture. Consolidation parties followed closely behind assault elements to establish defenses under fire. The most notable development of the month occurred on September 15, 1916 during operations near Flers and Courcelette, when armored fighting vehicles were employed in combat for the first time. These vehicles, later designated as tanks, were introduced to support infantry assaults by crossing wire obstacles, suppressing machine gun positions, and providing moving cover. The tanks deployed in September were mechanically complex and limited in number. Many experienced mechanical failure before reaching the front line. Others became immobilized by terrain, shell holes, or mechanical breakdown during the advance. Where they functioned as intended, tanks were able to traverse wire entanglements and engage enemy positions with onboard weapons. The presence of tanks affected local conditions. In sectors where tanks advanced alongside infantry, some German positions were suppressed or abandoned temporarily. Infantry units were able to follow behind these vehicles to reach objectives that had resisted previous assaults. In other areas, tanks failed to arrive or became disabled, and infantry advances proceeded without their support. German responses to the appearance of tanks varied. Small arms fire was largely ineffective against armored vehicles, but artillery fire posed a significant threat. Tanks were vulnerable to direct hits and immobilization. German units adapted rapidly, targeting tanks with artillery and concentrating fire on accompanying infantry. The introduction of tanks did not alter the overall operational pattern. Their limited numbers, mechanical unreliability, and slow speed restricted their impact. While they contributed to localized successes, they could not be deployed in sufficient strength to achieve broad penetration. Artillery-infantry coordination remained uneven. In some sectors, creeping fire provided effective suppression, allowing infantry to advance more closely behind the barrage. In others, communication failures and timing errors resulted in gaps between fire and movement. Smoke, dust, and terrain continued to complicate observation and adjustment of the fire. German defensive adaptation continued throughout September. Defensive positions were repaired or relocated as needed. Machine gun placements were adjusted based on observed attack patterns. Artillery fire plans were revised to account for Allied changes in approach. Defensive depth and counterattack capability remained intact. Terrain conditions influenced outcomes significantly. The battlefield had been heavily altered by weeks of shelling. Cratered ground impeded the movement of infantry, artillery, and vehicles. Routes for supply and reinforcement required constant maintenance. Tanks in particular were affected by ground conditions, with many becoming stuck or delayed. The weather during September was mixed. Periods of dry weather facilitated movement and operations, while rainfall degraded ground conditions locally. Weather variability affected the timing and execution of attacks, as well as the performance of equipment. Casualties remained high. Infantry units engaged in repeated assaults and consolidation tasks sustained continuous losses. Artillery units also suffered casualties from counter-battery fire. The addition of tanks did not reduce casualty rates across the front, though localized reductions were observed in specific actions. French forces continued operations in adjacent sectors, employing refined artillery techniques and maintaining pressure on German defenses. Coordination between Allied forces supported mutual operations and limited the German ability to shift forces freely along the front. Command and control challenges persisted. Telephone lines were frequently cut, requiring repair under fire. Runners remained essential for message transmission, but were vulnerable to artillery and small arms fire. The complexity of coordinating artillery, infantry, and new equipment increased demands on command staff. Logistical support continued to operate under strain. Ammunition consumption remained high. Fuel and maintenance requirements for tanks added to logistical complexity. Engineering units worked to maintain routes and positions, often under fire. Operational reports compiled during September recorded both progress and limitations. Certain objectives were captured that had resisted earlier attacks. Villages such as Flows were taken after prolonged fighting. However, advances remained limited in depth, and consolidation was often followed by German countermeasures. The pattern of operations during September demonstrated that tactical adaptation could improve local outcomes, but could not overcome structural constraints alone. Firepower, coordination, and new equipment altered the immediate conduct of assaults, but did not remove the advantages of prepared defense. By the end of September, the Somme front reflected incremental change. Some tactically important ground had been secured. German defenses remained coherent, though under strain. Allied forces continued to adapt methods while sustaining high levels of expenditure and loss. During October 1916, operations along the Somme front were increasingly shaped by environmental conditions and the limits of logistical endurance. Combat continued across multiple sectors, but the conduct and tempo of operations were constrained by weather, terrain degradation, equipment wear, and the cumulative strain on supply and support systems. These factors operated continuously and affected both attacking and defending forces. Rainfall increased markedly during October. Periods of sustained rain saturated the already damaged ground. Trench systems collapsed in places as walls caved in and drainage failed. Communication trenches filled with water and mud, restricting movement and increasing exposure. Shell craters accumulated standing water, forming continuous obstacles across no man's land and recently captured ground. The physical transformation of the battlefield altered movement at every level. Infantry advances became slower and more exhausting. Troops carrying full loads struggled to maintain formation across mud that varied in depth and consistency. Falls and injuries increased. Evacuation of wounded became more difficult as stretcher bearers navigated flooded trenches and cratered ground under fire. Artillery operations were affected directly. Gun platforms sank or shifted, reducing accuracy and requiring constant repair. Moving guns forward across damaged terrain became increasingly difficult. Horses and mechanical transport were strained by mud and congestion. Ammunition delivery slowed as supply routes deteriorated. In some sectors, guns were unable to fire at planned rates due to resupply delays or mechanical issues. The condition of roads and railheads became a limiting factor. Temporary roads constructed earlier in the campaign deteriorated under heavy use and rain. Tramways and narrow-gauge rail lines required continuous maintenance. Engineering units worked to reinforce routes with timber, planking, and stone where available, but resources were finite. Delays in supply movement affected artillery firing schedules and infantry resupply. Infantry equipment suffered from prolonged exposure to wet conditions. Rifles and machine guns required frequent cleaning to remain operational. Malfunctions increased despite maintenance efforts. Clothing and footwear deteriorated rapidly. Exposure to cold and wet contributed to illness, reducing effective manpower even in units not directly engaged in combat. German forces faced similar challenges. Defensive positions flooded or collapsed. Movement through trench networks became slower and more hazardous. Artillery resupply encountered delays as routes deteriorated. However, defensive positions often benefited from reduced offensive mobility. Mud limited the speed and cohesion of attacks, increasing the effectiveness of defensive fire. Operational planning during October reflected these constraints. Attacks were conducted on narrower fronts and often postponed or curtailed due to conditions. Objectives were adjusted to account for reduced mobility and the difficulty of consolidation. Artillery preparation was shortened or modified to conserve ammunition and account for resupply limitations. Combat actions during the month frequently involved close-range fighting over limited objectives. Villages, trench junctions, and small areas of high ground were contested repeatedly. Gains were often shallow and required immediate reinforcement to prevent loss. Counterattacks occurred under difficult conditions, with both sides struggling to move forces rapidly. The strain on medical services intensified. Casualty clearing stations operated in flooded areas with limited shelter. Evacuation routes were congested and vulnerable to fire. Delays in evacuation increased the severity of wounds and mortality rates. Medical personnel worked under continuous pressure to manage casualty flow. Communications deteriorated further. Telephone lines laid in shallow trenches were frequently cut by shell fire and water damage. Repair efforts were hampered by mud and exposure. Runners faced increased risk and delay. Visual signaling was limited by poor visibility and weather conditions. Commanders often operated with delayed or incomplete information. The cumulative effect of these factors reduced operational tempo. Attacks required longer preparation and yielded smaller gains. Artillery fire was less flexible due to logistical constraints. Infantry units required longer periods for recovery and reorganization after engagements. Rotation of units became more difficult as movement slowed. German defensive adaptation continued despite these challenges. Defensive lines were adjusted to account for ground conditions. Machine gun placements were repositioned to cover approaches altered by mud and flooding. Artillery fire plans were revised to target likely avenues of advance constrained by terrain. By mid-October, the battlefield in many areas had become nearly impassable. In some sectors, movement off established tracks was impossible. Troops advancing across open ground were funneled into predictable routes, increasing vulnerability to fire. The difficulty of moving supplies forward limited the ability to sustain prolonged attacks. Equipment losses increased. Artillery pieces, transport vehicles, and engineering equipment were damaged or immobilized by mud and shelling. Recovery and repair operations were slow and hazardous. Replacement of equipment lagged behind losses, further constraining operations. The persistence of operations under these conditions reflected the demands placed on forces already committed. Positions captured earlier in the campaign required defense regardless of conditions. Withdrawal posed its own risks and was not undertaken lightly. As a result, units continued to operate within an environment increasingly hostile to sustained offensive action. German forces, while also affected by conditions, benefited from the defensive advantage conferred by reduced Allied mobility. Counterattacks, though difficult to mount, were often directed against limited objectives and exploited the slow movement of attackers. By late October, the cumulative impact of environmental and logistical factors had reshaped the character of the fighting. Operations were marked by reduced scope, slower tempo, and heavy physical strain. Gains were minimal relative to effort expended. The battlefield environment itself became a decisive factor influencing outcomes. The month demonstrated the limits of sustained industrial warfare under adverse environmental conditions. Logistics, engineering, and endurance became as significant as firepower in determining what could be achieved. The interaction of weather, terrain, and supply imposed constraints that neither side could fully overcome. By November 1916, combat along the Somme front continued under conditions shaped by exhaustion, environmental degradation, and cumulative material loss. Operations conducted during the middle of the month were narrower in scope than earlier phases and focused on specific tactical objectives in the northern sector. These actions culminated in the final major offensive effort of the campaign, conducted between the 13th and the 18th of November 1916, commonly referred to as the Battle of the Ancre. Preparations for operations in November took place under severe constraints. Weather conditions remained poor. Rain, cold, and mud continued to affect movement and supply. Ground conditions limited the deployment of artillery and the movement of infantry. Despite these limitations, planning proceeded for a limited offensive intended to secure ground that had resisted capture earlier in the campaign. The area of operations lay north of the Ancre River, including positions near Beaumont-Hamel, Beaucourt, and surrounding high ground. These areas had been heavily fortified and had withstood repeated attacks during the opening months of the campaign. German defensive positions in this sector included deep trenches, reinforced strongpoints, and well-sited machine gun emplacements. Artillery preparation for the November operations was more limited in scale and duration than earlier bombardments. Ammunition availability, gun wear, and logistical constraints dictated shorter fire plans. Artillery fire focused on known defensive positions, wire obstacles, and artillery targets. Counter-battery efforts continued, though results varied. Infantry units assigned to the operation included formations that had gained experience during earlier fighting. Assault plans emphasized limited objectives and rapid consolidation. Advances were planned to take advantage of frozen ground conditions that temporarily improved movement across otherwise impassable terrain. The attack commenced on November 13th, 1916 under early morning conditions marked by frost and fog. In some areas, frozen ground allowed infantry to move more easily than in previous weeks. Artillery fire lifted according to schedule, and assault units advanced toward German positions. Initial results varied by sector. In the Beaumont-Hamel area, infantry units succeeded in capturing positions that had previously resisted attack. German defenses were penetrated, and prisoners were taken. Gains included frontline trenches and supporting positions, marking one of the more successful advances in this part of the front during the campaign. Further south, near Beaucourt, advances achieved additional ground. Infantry units crossed the Ancre River and secured positions on the northern bank. These gains altered the local defensive geometry and reduced German observation over adjacent areas. Consolidation efforts began immediately to secure captured ground against counterattack. German responses followed established defensive practice. Artillery fire was brought down on newly occupied positions. Local counterattacks were launched where conditions permitted. However, the ability to organize rapid countermeasures was reduced by terrain conditions, losses sustained earlier in the campaign, and the limited scale of available reserves. Communications during the operation remained fragile. Telephone lines were disrupted by shell fire and ground conditions. Runners and visual signals were employed, though fog and poor visibility limited effectiveness. Despite these challenges, command elements were able to coordinate consolidation and reinforcement with greater effectiveness than during earlier phases, in part due to the limited scope of objectives. Casualties occurred on both sides. British losses during the November operations were significant, but lower than those sustained during earlier large-scale assaults. German losses included killed, wounded, and captured personnel, particularly in sectors where defenses were overrun. The capture of prisoners confirmed defensive strain. The ground captured during the Battle of the Ancre included areas that had remained under German control since 1914. These gains improved local positions and removed certain observation points previously used by German forces. However, advances remained limited in depth and did not constitute a broad breakthrough. Weather conditions deteriorated following the initial days of fighting. Thawing ground returned mud to the battlefield. Movement slowed once again. Supply and evacuation routes became increasingly difficult to maintain. These conditions limited the feasibility of further offensive action. By November 18, 1916, active offensive operations were halted. The decision to terminate major attacks reflected the combined effect of weather, exhaustion, and the limited potential for further gain under existing conditions. Units were ordered to consolidate positions and prepare for defensive holding. The termination of operations did not occur as a result of a collapse on either side. Front lines stabilized following the November actions. Artillery fire continued intermittently, but large-scale infantry assaults ceased. The Somme front entered a period of relative operational pause as winter conditions set in. Material conditions at the conclusion of the campaign reflected extensive wear. Artillery pieces required an overhaul. Ammunition stocks were depleted. Transport systems were strained. Infantry units were reduced in strength and required rest, refit, and reinforcement. Medical services continued to treat casualties from ongoing shell fire and exposure. German forces likewise faced exhaustion. Defensive units had sustained continuous engagement for months. Positions required repair and reinforcement. Supply difficulties increased as winter conditions worsened. Despite these challenges, the defensive system remained intact. The November operations demonstrated that limited, well-prepared attacks could still achieve tactical success under constrained conditions. At the same time, They confirmed the diminishing returns of offensive action in late autumn. The environmental and logistical context imposed limits that outweighed the potential benefits of continued attack. By the close of November 18, 1916, the Battle of the Somme had effectively concluded as a major offensive campaign. Combat continued in the sector in the form of artillery exchanges and local actions, but the large-scale operations that had defined the preceding months were ended by operational decision. Following the cessation of large-scale offensive operations in November 1916, the effects of the Somme campaign became accessible through accumulated records of casualties, territorial change, force condition, and material expenditure. These outcomes were documented by military authorities during and after the fighting and formed the basis for subsequent evaluation of the campaign's results. Territorial change along the Somme front was limited in scale. At its greatest extent, Allied advances reached a depth of approximately 10 kilometers in certain sectors. The front line was altered unevenly, with some tactically significant positions captured and others remaining under German control. Gains were concentrated in areas where defensive systems were penetrated incrementally and consolidated over time. No continuous breakthrough of the German defensive system occurred. Casualties constituted the most significant measurable outcome. Combined losses across all participating forces exceeded 1 million casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. British forces sustained approximately 420,000 casualties during the campaign. French losses were lower but substantial, numbering around 200,000 casualties. German losses are estimated at between 450,000 and 500,000 casualties, though precise figures vary due to differences in record-keeping and classification. These figures reflected the prolonged and sustained nature of the fighting. Casualties were incurred not only during major assaults, but also through continuous artillery fire, counterattacks, patrol actions, and exposure to environmental conditions. Medical services on all sides recorded high rates of evacuation and treatment over the 5 months. Material expenditure was extensive. Artillery ammunition consumption reached levels unprecedented at the time. Millions of shells were fired, resulting in significant where-to-gun barrels and equipment. Transport systems were heavily utilized and damaged. Engineering resources were consumed in the construction and repair of trenches, roads, railways, and supply installations. Replacement of material required sustained industrial output. The condition of participating armies at the conclusion of the campaign reflected cumulative strain. British formations had absorbed heavy losses but gained extensive experience in large-scale operations under trench warfare conditions. Training systems, staff procedures, and logistical organization were adjusted in response to lessons learned during the campaign. These adjustments were reflected in subsequent operational planning. French forces emerged from the campaign with reduced offensive capacity compared to earlier phases of the war, reflecting the combined impact of Verdun and the Somme. However, French units maintained defensive cohesion and continued to hold extensive sectors of the Western Front. French artillery and staff experience remained central to Allied operations. German forces were affected by sustained attrition. Defensive units experienced high casualty rates and material loss. The requirement to rotate divisions through the Somme sector disrupted unit cohesion. German command records note increasing difficulty in maintaining defensive depth and replacing experienced personnel at the same rate as losses. Nevertheless, the defensive system remained intact at the end of the campaign. Operational outcomes recorded during the campaign indicated that prepared defenses could be penetrated locally, but not decisively under existing conditions. The relationship between artillery fire, infantry movement, and defensive survivability was documented extensively. These records informed subsequent doctrinal development on all sides. The campaign did not produce an immediate strategic decision. The Western Front remained a continuous fortified system after November 1916. However, the distribution and condition of forces were altered. German units committed to the Somme were unavailable for operations elsewhere during the period. Allied forces maintained sustained pressure over an extended duration. Command assessments compiled after the campaign emphasized measurable effects rather than singular conclusions. Reports cited the degradation of enemy manpower, the capture of specific terrain features, and the development of improved operational methods. At the same time, they recorded the high cost incurred and the limitations encountered. Historical evaluation of the Somme has remained the subject of continued examination. Contemporary records demonstrate that interpretations varied even during the war. Some assessments emphasize the scale of loss relative to territorial gain. Others focused on the cumulative impact on enemy forces and institutional development within participating armies. The persistence of debate reflects the complexity of the campaign rather than uncertainty about its factual record. Casualty figures, territorial outcomes, and material expenditure are well documented. Differences arise in how these elements are weighed relative to strategic objectives and long-term effects. Measured against immediate objectives, the campaign did not achieve a decisive breakthrough. Measured against the broader operational context, it absorbed substantial enemy resources over an extended period. Both assessments are grounded in documented outcomes rather than retrospective reinterpretation. By the end of 1916, the Battle of the Somme stood as one of the largest and most costly engagements of the First World War. Its outcomes were defined by limited territorial change, extensive casualties, and significant institutional consequences for all participating forces. These results were recorded contemporaneously and formed part of the evolving understanding of industrialized warfare on the Western Front. The campaign concluded as a completed operation rather than an unresolved engagement. Its effects persisted in the condition of armies, the state of the front, and the accumulated record of combat experience. The historical significance of the Somme derives from these documented outcomes and the scale at which they were produced.